The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. With the coming of evening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us cross over to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him just as he was in the boat. And there were other boats with him. Then it began to blow a gale, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that it was almost swamped. But he was in the stern, his head on the cushion, asleep. They woke him and said to him, "Master, do you not care? We're going down." And he woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Quiet now, be calm." And the wind dropped and all was calm again. Then he said to them, "Why are you so frightened? How is it that you have no faith?" They were filled with awe and said to one another, "Who can this be? Even the wind and the sea obey him." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. At the end of the Gospel this morning, we hear Jesus make reference to the lack of faith of the disciples. And it's very helpful that Jesus does this because he gives us the key which helps us to unlock the event which had unfolded up until that point. Here's what's at hand. Here's what's really at issue. It's a question about the disciples' faith. Now, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples, because Mark describes this circumstance in very brief language. But I think when we start to infer a little bit what these disciples went through, we can see what kind of extreme circumstance they find themselves in. First off, it's evening. And Jesus says, "All right, let's go to the other side of the lake, the Sea of Galilee." Now, this would have been a journey of several kilometres, but they're about to undertake it at night. Now, we're not talking about a time when you've got, red for port and green for starboard. You've got some nice navigation lights. You've got GPS. You've got radar. All right, guys, let's go. No. When it's dark, it's dark. And once you push out from the shore, there are no street lights to guide you. The landmarks on the shore of the Sea of Galilee kind of disappear into blackness. But you've got moon, you've got the stars. Until this storm starts and the clouds cover them. Now you need to picture blackness. Now, one of the things about the Sea of Galilee is that it's surrounded by hills. And when the wind starts to blow, it comes to be channeled into these gullies. And then when it hits the Sea of Galilee, it whips up waves very quickly. The Sea of Galilee is quite shallow. And so the amplitude of the waves becomes quite high and very quickly. But don't worry. You've got Peter and James and John and Andrew. They're all fishermen. They're very familiar with boats, with navigation. We'll be okay. Until we hear that the waves now start to break into the boat. Now we're in trouble. Now we're being threatened with being swamped. Now, given that this journey is several kilometres long, you could imagine that in the daylight, on a fine day, you might be able to swim to shore. But in the darkness, when you don't know which direction the shore is even in, you're goners. And you can imagine in this moment just this deep desire in the disciples, I want to be somewhere else right now. There's nothing to stand on. There's nothing solid. We're at risk of sinking. Now, have I painted a terrifying enough picture for you? It's frightening. And suddenly the disciples are confronted with the reality that, you know what? I've got no help except for God. I'm completely in his hands. There's nothing I can do to help myself anymore. I'm entirely dependent on him. Now, once we start to put ourselves in the disciples' shoes, I think we start to discover pretty quickly that these kinds of storms will erupt in our own lives at times as well. Perhaps not in identical circumstances, but this recognition that our lives are vulnerable and that finally I'm dependent entirely upon God. Well, this can come about when we ourselves experience terror or fear. It can happen to us when we're exhausted and don't feel like we can go on, or when we experience despair, that lack of hope which can't see how the future could possibly unfold in a way that is going to lead to my survival or my flourishing. When we experience confusion and unknowingness about the future ahead, pain can do it to us. When all of a sudden this experience of pain becomes something that I can't even imagine being without anymore. And grief can do it to us as well. When we've suffered a loss so acute that we can't possibly bear continuing. I think suddenly we find ourselves in the same shoes as the disciples. Now, the weird thing here is that they turn to Jesus and he's asleep in the back. His head's on a pillow. Now, at the most practical level, you can wonder, how on earth is Jesus possibly asleep? This boat must have been rocking. And you can almost picture the disciples having to kind of counter their weight with the movement of the boat, just trying to keep this thing upright. Judas is in the back, he's vomiting over the side because he's seasick, and everyone's just trying to bail with their hands. How is Jesus still asleep? How is it that the water coming over the side of the boat hasn't woken him up? There's something strange here, isn't there? There's something that needs to be explained. Well, I think there's this revealing moment when the disciples do finally wake Jesus up and they ask him one question. Don't you care? Don't you care that we're going down? I think that question reveals a lot about the disciples and where they're at. Because remember, they've been with Jesus for quite some time now. They've seen him preaching to the poor. They've seen him give sight to the blind. They've seen him cause the lame to walk. They've seen him cleanse lepers. They've seen him drive out devils. They've seen that he cares. They've seen that he is the one who is spending himself for the good of others. But now they're not so sure. Now they're not so sure that he really cares and cares about them. Maybe they suspect that with Jesus in the boat, that he's going to drown too. That we're all in it together and we're all going down. There's something about the disciples where they still don't know Jesus. And I think that's where the panic comes from. Because contrast now the fact that these disciples are in fret, but Jesus is asleep. How is it that he can sleep through this storm, through this panic? Well, clearly, Jesus isn't worried. Everything's fine. What are you so fussed about? We're all in God's hands. This storm isn't out of control for Jesus. And the darkness, the wind, the waves, their vulnerability, he's not fussed. Jesus can sleep. I think here we find out something important about the disciples. This storm is the very thing that brings about new trust in Jesus. That when this storm is calmed, they now suddenly discover that, you know what? My life is in God's hands. You know what? He does care. You know what? I actually had no need to be afraid in the first place. This word faith, it's not simply something that refers to an intellectual understanding, having the right idea about Jesus, being able to say true things about Jesus. No, this word faith now is much more akin to trust. That I now trust him. That I know that he's in the boat. That his sleeping isn't a sign of his lack of caring. And that he can deal with every storm. I wonder what the disciples will be like in the next storm. With Jesus in the boat, are they going to be as threatened? Are they going to be as afraid? I think it's a young faith that looks for God to intervene miraculously at every moment, to take away hardship, to take away difficulty, to take away suffering. But I think it's a more mature faith that these disciples are now invited into, to recognise that, you know what, Jesus is in the boat. But he's not a victim of the boat. He's the Lord, and the Lord of the storm. And every storm finally is in his hands. He knows the wind speed. He knows the barometer's dropping. And he's still with us. I think we are invited into that kind of trust. We are invited into that kind of mature faith. Because the fact is, storms happen. We will all experience the diagnosis of an illness that will finally be the end of us. We will all experience loss and sorrow. We will all experience confusion and trial and suffering. Storms happen. But it's our trust in the Lord that helps us to recognize that, you know what? He's in the boat with me. Whether it's fine weather or poor weather. Whether we feel like that it's all about to sink. He's there, and he's there with us. I think we grow in this mature kind of faith by our daily contact with Jesus. When we're able to pray and pray consistently, we come to know our Lord Jesus in an intimate way, and we come to know his presence in an intimate way, and we see the unfolding of our lives according to his plan and according to his providence, such that when the wind starts to blow and when the sun sets, that indeed we know who Jesus is, and the one who is sleeping in the back seat, he's calm because he can be, because he's Lord and he's on our side.